That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Xólotl, short story collection. 5 short stories that are each connected in one way or another to Jorge's hometown of León in Mexico. Israel Chávez, well, I should say Israel Chávez Barreto, holds PhD in semiotics from Tartu University. I'm reading this verbatim. In semiotics from Tartu University and is currently associate professor of history of linguistics and phonology at the Department of General Linguistics at Palacký University, Olomouc. His main research interests are change and variation of sign systems, the history of ideas, and history and epistemology of language sciences. I believe Israel has a slide to share, and then the rest will be just spoken.
So you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So, yeah, first, I'm sorry that we are not there in person. I am a little bit sick, and so we decided to move to fully online. But well, now this second part, it's a bit experimental because originally the idea is just to have some talk with Jorge, and well, I would like him to talk more, but I like all this time up to now, up to this moment, I was thinking what was the best way of doing things, because I don't know if it has ever happened to you that you can say that you want to say something about a work that you like, and you also have the person who wrote this work. So I am in between, confused because I want to impress Jorge by, showing him how well I read his book, but I also want him to talk more. So I don't know, maybe if you want, Jorge, maybe you can say a little bit about your new book, Xólotl. We are talking about this also, not only because Jorge is our friend, but also because one of the short stories, I think it relates very much to the topic of this session. But Jorge, tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah. So, yeah. Hello, everyone. I hope that this experimental talk, like Israel is defining it, is interesting to the semiotician crowd. So my short story collection, it's called Xólotl, as Tyler very well pronounced it, and it's a compilation of 5 short stories. They all take place in Mexico. Most of them connect either tangentially or they take place in the city where I come from, which is called León. And they all deal with current Mexican reality. Most of you are probably aware of what that reality looks like, at least from what gets to you from the news. So they deal with different kinds of violence in Mexico, but mostly I think, and that's where maybe the semiotic perspective comes into place. They don't deal with the violence itself, but rather with how that violence is interpreted by the people who either suffer it or witness it. And so these 5 short stories, one of them is called Rosario, and I'm gonna give like very brief synopsis of the stories. The first one is called Rosario, and it's about a girl, a Mexican girl, who's doing an exchange program in Paris, and she's an anthropologist. Archaeologist, sorry, and she wants to visit the catacombs in Paris, and she's introduced to this cataphile movement of people like amateur speleologists who go into the larger catacombs, not the touristic side of it, and sort of lines reality and time and space between Mexico and the catacombs starts to blur. And the story revolves around what death means to us and what time does to death symbols. So how differently we interpret things like skulls and bones in general, depending on whether they are from a very long time ago or whether they are from our current reality. And then there's like a movie. That's the title of another story, and it's about dead people that assassinated or killed people in Mexico whose bodies keep coming back, right? So the bodies from unsolved murders keep coming back to the place where they were first found, and how mostly authorities and the population try to make sense of it. And then there's Xólotl, which gives its title to the short story collection, which is about a startup, an AI startup in Mexico that is really probably an Aztec god cult. And then there's Galatea, which is the one that we're going to talk about, which is kind of a retelling of the Pygmalion myth to discuss the topic of femicide in Mexico. And the last one is called Quimera, and it's about a young man in Mexico who's trying to get a grip of his sexual orientation and identity in a very, very conservative city. And it's told in a Rashomon kind of way. So there's a lot of perspectives because there's a crime at the center of it. And yeah, it's interesting because I started writing these stories when I was still doing my master's in Tartu. So in 2019, I wrote the first couple of them, Galatea being one of them. So I think that for sure there's some semiotic thinking in them, even if I'm not aware of it. And I'm very, very excited. When Israel told me first that he liked the short story collection, I was thrilled because I know that he's a really good reader and that he's honest too. So he's my friend, but he wouldn't be enthusiastic if he doesn't mean it. But also because when he sent me his interpretation of Galatea, it's almost like he explained the short story to me. Like my own short story made more sense to myself after I read his interpretation. And I think that's what we're going to discuss mostly today, and how it relates to the topic of selfhood and otherness.
Yes, indeed. Yes, thank you. So, okay, so as Jorge mentioned, I wrote a little commentary on one of his short stories, Galatea, and well, I will read it, and I will try to be very brief. And well, there was, I started with a very sort of quick introduction about the connections between literature and semiotics. And I was talking about Severo Sarduy and Barthes and Telquel and Bolaño, and then all this fascination that semioticians have with Borges and with Poe and Conan Doyle. And we all know this book, The Sign of Three. And well, also, many semioticians have worked a lot with literary figures, like Lotman worked a lot with Pushkin, Torop has been working a lot with Dostoevsky, and so on. Then I was talking a little bit about Jorge and about his own work, because he has also worked a lot with Bolaño, and I think currently he's also working with Bolaño's works. But well, yeah, besides this connection between literature and semiotics, there is this, or rather, one last comment on that. There is this phrase of Umberto Eco that he said of what one cannot theorize, one must narrate. And I believe that maybe this means that we should read some literature in a kind of semiotic key. And this is what I will try to do. So, as Jorge mentioned, out of the 5 stories, I just want to briefly discuss this Galatea one. So, as you know, and as Jorge already mentioned, this is kind of Flores, Jorge's own take on Pygmalion. But in Flores Galatea, we encounter rather a dissatisfied sculptor and his brother-in-law, who, after a series of demonstrations by feminist groups in León, they found a statue of a woman. And I was thinking also that it's very nice. Today it's 7th. Tomorrow it will be. So good. We are showing our solidarity. The statue is all covered in purple, red, and black painting. And purple is the color of the feminist movement in Mexico. Red and black are practically international colors for strike. Now, the men, despite the state in which they found the statue, are in awe of its beauty. And so they take it home, they clean it, they put it in the garden where they can freely admire it. Now, the sculptor, he becomes so infatuated with the statue that the relationship with his own wife rapidly deteriorates. He becomes possessive of the statue. And this possessiveness, plus the spell that the statue seems to put upon men, because the brother-in-law is being driven to satisfy his desires in front of the statue, only to infuriate the sculptor, finally pushes the sculptor to throw his wife and her brother out of the house. And when he's finally alone with the statue, she comes to life. But now, at this point, I want to ask, what exactly does this phrase mean, to come to life? Because in this question and in its answer, it is hidden, I claim, a big part of the problem that Flores' story seems to pose. So let us try to give an answer to this question that it's by no means, by any means biological. It's a strictly semiotic answer. So in contemporary semiotics, it is not unusual to state that for something to be alive, it is enough if it interprets. So to interpret in this context, is tantamount to say that whatever is alive can make choices. Crucially, this is due to the way in which the notion of sign is defined. If one assumes that signs involve meaning, or that they refer to something that is meaningful, it is often assumed that what this meaning consists of is not reducible to the materiality of the thing that is being referred. In fact, a sign can only have a meaning if it can, in principle, refer to multiple things. So meaning is essentially plural, so it is said. And it is the selection of one of these things as the meaning of a given sign what constitutes an act of interpretation. This act, thus consisting in making meaning determined, if only temporarily. Because in the act of interpretation, whatever it makes, the interpretation is faced with at least two conflicting options, since meaning is plural. To interpret is to choose, and it is in the act of interpretation that both signs and interpreter come into being. Semioticians have more or less assumed that this is the case in a more or less definite way for at least for human beings. Yet, it seems to me that in accepting such premise, we need to revise what happens with the rest of our theoretical edifice. Because meaning is plural, and it only becomes determined in an act of interpretation. Because of that, a given material thing can function as a different sign, having those different meanings that will depend upon the interpreter. It is usual for semiotics to assume that a sign is always relative to an interpreter. And in fact, taking this statement to its last consequences, it is usually assumed that to the extent that interpreters need signs to perform even their vital operations, interpreters live in a world of signs, or rather in a world begotten by signs. Yet signs do not simply reflect material objects. They do not present them in a neutral way, but only in some respects, depending on the interpreter. And this is crucial. A solipsist would be tempted to say that reality is thus unreachable. Semioticians, most of them at least, thinks that this very mechanism of science actually allows users of science, especially humans at least, but this is debatable, to distinguish between the reality created by science and material reality. So this reality, semioticians claim, can be and is reachable, this material reality. And they base their claims on a model of science that is built mostly, but not only, upon the logic of scientific discoveries. Be that as it may, I would simply like to point out for now that the traits we have recognized in science do lead, at the very least, to a confusion between reality as it is relative to us and reality as it is independent of us. For some semioticians, this is tantamount to say that semiotics actually gives us tool to distinguish reality from illusions, as we were talking about. But let us see if there is really something to distinguish. So we human beings who are alive seem to be most assured of the fact that we can control our actions, regardless of whether one believes in free will or in a deterministic universe. We could maybe agree on the fact that some actions are internal to us and are controlled by mechanisms that are ours, while other actions pertain to mechanisms that are not ours. It is the notion of selfhood that I want to get at. From a semiotic point of view, which mostly assumes free will and tries very hard to explain it, humans can be undoubtedly counted as being alive because they can choose. Their capacity of choose crucially depends upon the ability to transform their own body at will. This capacity to choose becomes clearer, especially when we choose not to transform our body in situations when, if there would be no effort, our body would transform. So when we refrain from grabbing food from a table, even though we are very hungry, or when we struggle with not trembling, even if we are in fear of something. Now, it is in discovering ourselves as rulers of our own body that we necessarily recognize other material things over which we do not and cannot rule. So we discover others. But, and this is of the utmost importance, the discovery of others is deeply intertwined with acts of interpretation, and what is even more, what guarantees to us that we can choose is that we can interpret. But signs are deceitful, at least to the extent that the reality they beget is not a reality that corresponds one-to-one to the material world. And if we don't have and can never have control over the other that assures us that we have control over ourselves, how can we be so certain that we do have a self if the mechanism by which we verify our selfhood is a mechanism that mostly begets illusions? To answer, I propose to shape a concept of resistance. And this notion of resistance, I will draw it in a sort of negative way, precisely from Flores' work. So back to the story. The statue comes to life, and in so doing, it timidly suggests that it is a hare. But it is important to notice that from the sculptor's point of view, he was always completely a hare. Now, the life imbued in her, it's different. She actually does not become a fully fledged human being because she ignores the fact that she can control her body and thus offers an unrestricted ruling over it to the sculptor, who, and this is also crucial, is not her sculptor. He did not make the statue, but simply found it and, in any case, fabricated it into a woman. Now, when I first read the story, I almost inevitably thought of Hitchcock's Vertigo, where Scotty, the protagonist, chases after this idealized version of a woman and ignores the real woman who is really in love with him. Although, well, in Hitchcock, they are the same women. Very much like Scotty in Vertigo, the sculptor fabricates this new ideal woman precisely as an ideal, his ideal, and thus as a mere projection of himself. And because of her statue nature, she shows no resistance. So she lives for the sculptor, and is completely at his disposal. This pleases greatly the man, at least at the beginning, because he sees in this now living woman statue a perfect companion, unsurpassable lover who caters to his every wish and is ready to participate in all the activities he likes. He reads to her the stories he likes, and he makes her listen to the music he likes. And all he gets in return when he asks if she likes anything is a permanent and almost meaningless yes. So her body too is also completely open to the man, and he rejoices in all the pleasures that were forbidden to him in his now longer marriage to a real woman. But soon enough, the situation becomes unbearable. He feels that her submissiveness becomes a chain for him. In her being completely submitted to his will, it is he who becomes her slave. She shows no resistance, and this is the crux of the matter. So, and here I have a small quotation by the Jorge's short story, and I will read it in Spanish. Esta rendición total de su voluntad a él lo agobiaba, lo asustaba y oscuramente lo mantenía subyugado. So this total surrendering of her will to him was worrisome, it frightened him, and obscurely it kept him under her control. So through her no resistance, the boundaries between them two simply blur. The no resistance forces him, the sculptor, to both acknowledge her as a mere projection, an extension of himself, and to resent her for, after all, she exists outside of him. But she gives the impression of being autonomous, but her no resistance turned her into an object in the usual, and in this case, very pejorative sense of the word, into something that can be simply used. Now, it seems to me that this is the main point that Flores' story wants to make. The story is, after all, a commentary on the violence, physical, psychological, and symbolical against women in Mexican society. And it is about precisely the way in which women are symbolically constructed and how this symbolical construction shapes the relation between genders, with each being reciprocally an other. Now, Rita Segato, a very famous anthropologist who has made research in gender violence, has repeatedly stated that violence against women is first and foremost a power struggle between men. In dominating a woman, a man, she says, aims for obtaining the respect of other men. The violence towards a woman, although physically directed to her, it is symbolically addressed to other men to gain the respect and admiration, as if violence against women would have an inherent homoerotic component. Flores' story follows on Segato's step, and the ultimate event that pushes the sculptor to exert all his cruelty over the woman statue is precisely the thought of there being another man, the thought of her surrendering body and will to someone else. And so he punishes her, he makes her perform the most vile sexual acts, or so it is suggested in the story, just to punish her for her no resistance, just to see if there truly is such a thing as no resistance. I will read another small passage. Augusto se volvió despiadado, sometiéndola a humillaciones cada vez más elaboradas, exigiéndole tributos cada vez más dolorosos, explotando cada centímetro de su cuerpo perfecto hasta agotar sus posibilidades, ya no por placer, sino para ponerla a prueba, para tantear sus límites, para saber si los tenía, y un poco también para castigarla por su dejarse hacer, por su permisividad desapegada que con cada nuevo encuentro lo atormentaba más, lo orillaba más y más cerca a tomar el papel de verdugo. So, in English, Augusto became merciless, humiliating her in more and more elaborated ways, demanding from her ever more painful tributes, exploiting every inch of her perfect body until all possibilities were exhausted. No longer for pleasure, but simply to test her, to take her to her limits, to know if she had any, and in some small measure also to punish her for her all-allowing disposition, for her careless permissiveness that with each new encounter tormented him more and pushed him more and more to assume the role of executioner. So, end of the quotation. It is so that the figure of the other man reappears. it was someone else. It was another sculptor, sorry, far more superior, who had created her. And it was him, that other sculptor, who made her without a will. So the need for an other who shows resistance appears in this way, and it is so satisfied. For the sculptor slave, she is ultimately given the full status of being an other when her no resistance is seen precisely as an act of resistance imposed to her by her creator, another sculptor. And so, in this way, the homoerotic and narcissistic relationship of the sculptor comes full circle, from his infatuation with what was merely his reflection to the blunt encounter with an alter ego, another sculptor that, instead of allowing everything, permits nothing. For the work is already done. So she was created in one way and one way only. It seems to me that the lessons of the story, if there are any, are that first, a solipsistic view does not hold. Even if science beget an illusory reality they have to measure up against a reality that resists, a reality that does not allow for everything. And this reality can be ourselves in abiding by the Lacanian cry of patu. The second lesson, not everything. The second lesson is, as the poet put it, je suis un autre. I am another. Whatever agency that inaugurates interpretation and thus gives rise to any notion of selfhood includes the other at its core. What counts, it is not the fact that we are an I in relation to a you. What counts is rather that any I is incomplete. I am another because I is not a totality. And it is its incompleteness what forces this I to recognize even itself as an other. The woman statue was complete. She was a one. Paradoxically, she was a whole because she was but a part, a figment of both sculptors' subjectivity and imagination. Because she was ideal, she was complete and unable to resist. It is only what is real that resists. Living beings, or at least humans, although assured of their unity, they carry inside them a concealed, a very deep and fundamental incompleteness. And we should then question if really a person is but a symbol involving a general idea, and if the consciousness of a general idea has a certain unity of the ego. Perhaps we can begin to question these ideas with the very same lines that the famous semiotician who formulated them held in such high esteem. Men, proud men, most ignorant of what he's most assured. And so, well, that was my little commentary on Jorge's Galatea story. But what I wanted to ask him was, first of all, because I really don't know what he thinks about what I said about his story. So I would really not like to know whether he really intended something like this, or because I know you also know, well, you know almost all the references I use. You know the work of Rita Segato. You know, yeah, Lacan. You work also with Lacan, and semiotic. You are a semiotician. So yeah, what do you think, and what was it really that you were trying to say? Because with this exegesis, there's always the question of the intensitio autoris, and you know, we have you here, so please, you tell us.
Yeah. Well, so I think, yeah, I agree with you, and I would frame it this way. I think that the intention of the story was what you read in it, but I think that, as I said before, you sort of explained the inner structure of the dynamics in the story, even to me. So I will frame it this way, like how I came up with the story and what my intention was. So this story was born in 2019 in August. I had just recently finished the master's in semiotics in Tartu, and I did my my thesis on Roberto Bolaño's 2666. So for those who haven't read the novel or are not acquainted with it, the biggest chapter in the novel deals with mass femicide in Santa Teresa, a fictional city in the northern border of Mexico, which is based on Ciudad Juárez. And so not only I read the novel several times, and so I was still deep in it, like my mind was still in it, but I also had to read several like either journalistic texts about the real cases in Ciudad Juárez or feminist studies on that violence. And so I was still deep in that when in Mexico there was this series of feminist manifestations all across the country, but specifically the biggest ones were in Mexico City. And they were precisely because at that point we were at a high in femicide numbers all across the country again. There were on average 10 women murdered per day in Mexico. And then a young girl, I mean, she was still underage. She tried to, I forgot the word in English, to denounce, like legally, with the police, an abuse case, and 4 police officers raped her. So this caused outrage, and just thousands of women went to the streets and protest. And they started in Mexico City and elsewhere in the country. Many monuments were tagged. And so like graffiti was painted on it. And the public's reaction, it was divided, of course, but a good deal of it was focused on the damages to monuments, right? Like a good deal of the public outrage was not this is happening to women in Mexico, and Mexican men are the ones exercising this violence, but rather you shouldn't paint this statue, right? You shouldn't do that. It's not like you can protest without damaging our beautiful scenic views in Mexico City. And so I was just really angry, and I started writing this story. And for me, the whole point since the beginning to the end of the story was it's a story about men. It's a story about precisely what you were talking about with Rita Segato, I think in the book that is called something like the inner structure of gender violence or something like that. She explains that there are 3 types of or 3 reasons for gendered violence. One of them was to punish a woman, like a generic woman that has sort of overstepped her role. But the other 2 are either to punish or exert some kind of vengeance against another man by sort of ruining his property, like a woman seen as property of a man, or either to impress other men, right? Which is what you were saying. And Bourdieu also has a book called Male or Dominance, I think, where he also talks a lot about how masculinity and virility are relational categories, but also agonistic categories. Not only virility tends to be defined in relation to other males' performance of masculinity, but also it's always threatened. Like every performance of masculinity by another man is it's a threat to my masculinity, right? So I have to respond somehow. And since violence in the public sphere has always been sort of a male privilege, the exertion of that violence, Bordeaux says, can become even sort of an imperative, right? And we see this even in folk, in popular culture. In Latin America, at least, there's a ton of songs that we still listen to that just talk about, and in the US as well, like what is called murder ballads. There's all of these tales of men killing women, right? And many times it's to defend their honor, right? And so it's all a performance. And in my story, what I wanted to do is sort of a grotesque theater of men, and Galatea, which is there's only two women in the story. One is Estela, the wife of the sculptor, and she gets out of the picture almost immediately, pushed by the sculptor. And the other is Galatea. But Galatea, like you very well put it, was never intended as a fully fledged human woman. She's just a symbol. She's a projection of the sculptor's desire, which to me is the sort of the essence of the original Galatea myth, like Pygmalion and Galatea. I always thought of that story like it's almost like a Narcissus story, right? Like you have this sculptor who sculpts the perfect woman for him and becomes obsessed with it, and Aphrodite is moved by this. And she grants life to the sculpture so that they can be together. So to me, this sort of represents the structure of like male desire towards women as something culturally built. You have projections of what a woman should be, an ideal woman, right? It has to abide by a certain beauty canon, but it also ideally should be like submissive, but crucially, it should be submissive only to your desires, to your will. And this is like the conundrum, right? And so in this story, I wanted to give the sculpture this punishment that he exerts on himself, because he sort of creates, and he doesn't create, as you point, because he's not the creator of the statue, but he's granted this woman who caters to all his desires, but she's just incapable of saying no, right? She is only capable of saying yes. And but the real relationships in the story, the real encounters with otherness are always with men, right? With his brother-in-law. At first they bond because we're told that they actually hated each other, but they become kind of friends in the beginning of the story because they admire this beautiful statue together. And this is something that also happens a lot between men. Like we see a classic example of this is a poor unsuspecting woman is just trying to live her life and walks by a construction site, and you have a bunch of guys yelling stuff at her and whistling, and obviously this performance of masculinity is for themselves. It's a bonding mechanism. It's not actually a strategy to seduce women. They know that won't work, right? It's a bonding mechanism, but when they are actually fixated on a woman, and another guy is fixated on the same woman, then that bonding becomes a challenge, and it becomes a competition, which is what happens in the story as well. When Augusto starts seeing his brother-in-law as potential competition, and then that develops, he feels like she has her entirely for himself, but then he goes out and parades her as his property. But then another guy comes in and he feels challenged again. So it's all about men against men. And of course, this violence, even though she's not a human woman and she has no will, and symbolically, of course, it's violence against all women, because she's meant to represent a woman. And but I think that at the core of this type of violence always lies the same root. Like, it's women, like a human seen as an object that only exists for you, you know. And so, but driving the point home, what I wanted to say is, I think that we agree. Like, I agree with your reading of the story, but I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't thought about it in the notion of. I think I wrote it here. So let me know if I'm right, because maybe I misread your thoughts. But so, in order to interpret, right, we have to choose, and in order to choose, we have to be conscious, or there has to be some sort of consciousness of the possibility of a choice, right? Because if there's no possibility of a choice and we're not conscious of that, then that's a very mechanic. Being aware of different possibilities is at the same time being aware of the sign being different from material reality, because material reality is just inaccessible and it's one thing, right? So I guess what I'm trying to drive at is, at least in human interpretation, does it mean that in order for material reality to be fragmented and multiplied through signs, the interpreter also has to be fragmented and multiple, and that is a precondition of selfhood? So that's why Galatea is whole, because she's just a symbol. She's just a symbol created by two men, the original sculptor and the sculptor who destroys her, basically, at the end.
Yeah.
And so yeah, what I want to say is, I was thinking of it on another level, like a maybe more surface level, in regards to the meaning making structure of the story, and reading it through your lens, because I'm not in semiotics anymore. I mean, I guess I am indirectly, but you have always been very much in there. So you made me aware of stuff that I wasn't aware of.
Yes.
Yeah, did
No, it's
any
okay.
of what
It's
I said
okay.
make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay. I was just thinking that semiotics might be a little bit like Hotel California, so you can check in anytime you want, but you can never leave. But
Yeah.
no. Thank you. Yes, because uh, so you were departing from a very concrete situation and sort of turning this into
Yeah.
something else. And in that regard, I have uh, many questions that are very deep questions I wanted to ask you, but I don't know how we are doing with time. So Tyler, can we talk more? Is it okay? Um, um,
Hello. Yeah, you can keep talking
okay,
if you want.
because
No, wait, 10 minutes.
Okay, so 10 minutes. So Jorge, let's do this. I will ask you one question. You can ask
Yeah.
me in 5 minutes. You can answer me. Oh, okay, let's have two choices. One, I can ask you something else in these 10 minutes, or we can open the conversation for other friends who maybe want to talk and maybe want to ask you something, or maybe want to challenge some of the things we have been saying.
Okay.
I know we have also some people from Mexico. And some good friends. I mean, I think we only have good friends here in the room. So yeah, what do you want?
Wow. Okay. Well, I guess that if you put the option to myself, like, I guess I can talk with you about it anytime, hopefully.
Yeah,
So maybe we can open the mic in case someone has a question.
perfect. Oscar, our good Oscar.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
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 Excellent. Thanks for this awesome dialogical exercise. I really enjoyed it, even though I haven't read your book yet. So it's an idea that I just want to share with you guys, and you tell me if this makes sense. So yeah, in my view, otherness is more real than the self, because otherness is resisting. It doesn't depend on our will, right? So experience is what makes the ego discover the non-ego. Um, so, and in your case, the artist or the author of the story. So artists know this very well because they do not want to force reality, but to experiment with it. And in doing so, they discover more about themselves than about reality itself in a way. So my question is, what did you discover about yourself through writing this story, Jorge?
Okay. Oh, that's a very difficult question. Well, I guess that one of the reasons that I wrote this story. So I don't know if anyone saw the last Martin Scorsese movie, The Killers of the Flower Moon, which I thought was great. And one of the things that was criticized about the movie was that he didn't like tell the story from the perspective of the Osage people, and he didn't he didn't tell their story, right? And I think that the reason he did that was because he was telling the story. He was sort of confessing the sins of his people, right? So he's telling the story of the white men who destroyed and killed and this these people in order to take their land. That's the story he wanted to tell and he had to tell. So it's a confession, not not a judgment, right? And so in that way, I guess one of the reasons I think this story was difficult to write and difficult to read, hopefully for men as well, for other readers, is because I really wanted the story to the main character in the story is a monster, or you can read him as a monster. He does horrible things, things that hopefully none of us present here will ever do, or even think of doing. Uh, but but we can all be complicit in the kind of parts of this thinking can inhabit all of us, right? Some in some much lesser way. So things like feeling possessive, things like being jealous, things like even cultural things that we regularly dismiss as as joking around or whatever, you know. And so I think to me, the story dies or triumphs in whether men who read the story can see a bit of themselves in it, because in the end there's an allusion to this thing happening in many places in Mexico, right? It's not just this story, but it's happening in many places. Yeah, we all participate in this performance of masculinity, right? And so I wanted to interrogate maybe also to what degree I participate in that. And it's the same with all the stories in the short story collection. Actually, I didn't want to make a didactic short story collection where I sort of come to everyone with the tables of the law, you know, and say, you know, this is what's morally right and this is what's morally wrong. Rather, I wanted to say like this is Mexico, you know, this nightmarish world is Mexico, and we all participate in it in some way or another. and I'm really drawn by the notion of resistance and that Israel brought about, and I think that applies also to the way that the story will be read, right? Like my intention writing it will be different from. There's a limit to my intention because readers will come and have their own interpretations of the stories, and I'm eager to know what those interpretations are as well.
Great. So I want a signed copy of the book in the future. Thanks.
Yeah.
So we're moving on to further questions and comments from the audience, I think.
Yes.
Needless to say, I'm always interested in hearing your most recent version of your explanation of the bachelor machine. That is this theoretical apparatus from your master's thesis, because it's all over this. Apparently, I haven't read your book of short stories because it's in Spanish, but in any case, I can tell that the bachelor machine is there. And I was thinking about it recently on our little trip. I was thinking about the bachelor machine because there are so many bachelors.
Yeah, totally. So very quickly, what Tyler's referring to, in case you're not aware of this artwork. So there's this one of Duchamp's, Marcel Duchamp's most famous works is called Le Grand Verre, or the bride, like stripped bare by its bachelors even. And so it represents two spheres that are disconnected from each other. On the top, there's a sort of a disjointed figure that is supposed to represent the bride. And the bride produces a love gasoline that makes a bunch of figurines in the lower half of the work just rotate endlessly. And these figurines are called the bachelors. So Duchamp explained that the movement of this machine is murdering the bride, right? And that's it. Yeah. So on the top you see that weird figure is supposed to be the bride, and on the bottom you have a machine that moves the bachelors. And so the thing that happens here, the structure of this desiring machine is like by their rotation, they are murdering the bride, but also this hard line in between them makes the dynamic just onanistic, masturbatory. They will never connect. They will never connect. And so this has later been interpreted by Michel Carrouche as a structure that repeats itself in art, especially in literature, many times. And my contention is that 2666, Bolaño mentions this artwork once in the novel, but in a very conspicuous way. And so I think that he made 2,666 as a bachelor machine, as a grand verre, and my story kind of replicates this notion as well, right? This desiring men are actually just they're just masturbating, and by their performance of masculinity, they're literally killing women who they actually never get to touch or know, or and so yeah, I continue to work on that on my PhD thesis, and I would be eager to bring it to some sort of semiotics presentation when I have it in a more developed stage.
Thank you. All right. Further questions, further comments?
I had one question, but it was very much related to what Oscar asked. So it was perfect question by Oscar. And yeah, more questions. Yeah.
If not, we can wrap it up. But I got a couple, two things. I'm gonna stop recording. Or well, I guess it doesn't matter. Anyway, the whole Q&A will be cut out. No, when did the Q&A begin? I'm not sure. Anyway, so in 2 weeks, March 21st, we have Rahul Murdeshwar, yes, from Tartu. Is he there in your crowd in Tartu? Is Tartu still with us? Yeah, they're still.
I don't think so.
He's not.
What a loser. Anyway, you better show up. I'm joking. I love Rahul. And I'm sure his talk's going to be great. It's always great.
Yeah, I haven't seen him. Where is he?
Yeah, where is he?
He's traveling.
Yeah. That's fine. That's acceptable. So yeah, it'll be Rahul and one of our own people here, Barbara Yurkova. Yep. Hold on one moment. Oh, there's the poster again. Hopefully you can see. Yeah. And that's on March 21st. That's in 2 weeks. It's going to be a Thursday. It's going to be the same time, same place as usual, but we will have an in-person event at the International Semiotics Institute here in Olomouc. For those of you who are here, want to come hang out. Second thing, actually tomorrow, Josh Bacigalupi, Augustus Bacigalupi, is giving a talk in my course here in Olomouc. And so I'm going to drop the link in the chat. It's going to be Zoom talk, so you can come hang out with us tomorrow if you want. It's at 10, and the link will be chat. And I'm going to leave the session open now for 5 minutes. For 5 minutes, so you can access the link, which you see there now. If you want to come. Isn't that right, Josh? Isn't that right? Yeah.
Yeah, so it'll be 11 o'clock our time here in Tartu.
Yeah, 11 o'clock Estonian time.
Yeah. I just have to finish the talk now.
Yeah, you just have to finish that. Well, I'll look at the audio files. I still haven't. I've been busy, but anyway. So
Yeah,
I'm going to leave the session. I'm going to leave the session open for 5 minutes so you can hit that link. Thanks to the speakers. Excellent session.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was awesome. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks everybody. That was really great.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Goodbye. Great.
check. This is Jossie